Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar with Rachael Cristine Woody. My name is Bradley, and I will be your moderator for this webinar titled Ask Me Anything, How to Prepare for a New Museum CMS. Before we start, I would like to provide some information about our company and introduce today's presenter. Lucidea is a software developing company specialized in museum and archival collections management solutions, as well as knowledge management and library automation systems. Our brands include Sydney, Presto, Argus, Archivera, Eloquent, and Quadrastar. Now, I would like to introduce today's presenter, Rachael Cristine Woody. Rachael is the owner of Relicura and provides services to museums, libraries, and archives. She specializes in museum collections management systems, digitization technology, digital project management, and digital usership. During the course of her career, she has successfully launched multiple digital projects that include advanced digitization technology, collaborative portals, and the migration of collection information into collections management systems. She is also a popular guest author for Lucidea's Think Clearly blog and has provided us with many great webinars in the past that are listed on our website. So please feel free to check those out after today's session. Take it away, Rachael.
Great. Thank you so much, Bradley. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today and for Lucidea for hosting us. So for the Ask Me Anything, we have three sort of sections where the questions and answers have been gathered. The first section that we'll talk about is how to prepare data for a new CMS. So all of your questions in that particular camp. The second section is how to conduct efficient data cleanup, one of our big topics that we've focused on over the last 6 months. And then finally, our last section is how to migrate data into a new CMS successfully. So each of these sections are building off some of the content that we've gone over these last 6 months, and I'll highlight those webinars at the end of this slide deck. So if you've missed one, you can go check out and get some more details. All right, first section, how to prepare data for a new CMS. And an excellent first question to begin with, where to begin. Step one is gather. So as you're looking to prepare yourself and your data to migrate into a new collections management system, start by gathering the data. So gathering data as an aggregate, taking a look at what all of the collection data is looking like, what sort of modules are you using, where are the different records living, and then running a report or reports on important areas of that data. So making sure that you are well aware of the important and critical data to your work and where that shows up in your current CMS. That way, none of that important data is perhaps accidentally left behind or perhaps migrated into a different part of the new CMS, which is not as helpful or as appropriate for what your needs are. And then final part of the gather piece, review controlled lists to ensure accuracy. For many of us, there's been a museum collections management system in place for years, if not decades, and much of our data evolves over time. Different practices come into fashion. Staff transitions are always agents for introducing new data changes. So practicing and taking a look at those controlled lists to make sure that everything is about as clean and smooth as possible for going into the new system. Step two of the where to begin is that review part. So once you've gathered data from those respective places, you're going to want to look for any inaccurate, incomplete, or missing data. While this is not necessarily something that you would have to fix prior to migration, it can have impacts on the migration process, and you don't want any surprises during that piece of getting into your new CMS. So the more you know about your data and where the potential gaps are, the better informed and more confident you'll be in making some of those migration decisions. Another part to look for is data in the wrong field or wrong format. And just like the first one, this is not necessarily something that has to be fixed prior to migration, but it can absolutely impact migration or the decisions you need to make. So ensuring, again, that there's no rude surprises getting into the new CMS, being aware of those and making the appropriate decisions based on your needs is very important. And final piece for review, records that don't meet the minimum requirements. This is a little lower stakes in terms of even if your records are incomplete, they can still migrate into a new CMS. That's not going to pose any sort of migration issues per se. But knowing that there are some data deficiencies, and if there's any sort of data analysis or cleanup happening prior to migration, you may want to include some of these records that are not meeting minimum requirements while you're already in the data and perhaps making some other data enhancements or corrections. Step 3 for the where to begin is then the plan. So gather, review, and now plan. Make a plan for how you intend to perform the data cleanup. And as you're making those decisions, consider the possible CMS tools you can use for cleanup, perhaps whether that is in your current CMS or in your anticipated new CMS, which typically, if you're able to upgrade, is offering more robust tools and perhaps some more efficient functionality that you could capitalize on once you get that data into the new CMS. Second, external to the CMS, there are tools to clean up via a spreadsheet format. So if your collection data is either in a spreadsheet already, or if you can export a spreadsheet from the current system, there are tools based in Excel spreadsheet that you can use. There's also Google Sheets if you don't have a Microsoft license that have similar data query and data cleanup, as well as an open source tool called OpenRefine that can also offer non-Microsoft or Google specific cleanup tools and queries to get that data cleaned up and enhanced in an efficient way before it goes into the new CMS. And also, of course, if your CMS, whether current or future, is being offered and is stewarded by a vendor. So this is the case where products that are proprietary and have a company behind it versus something that is perhaps open source. Because there is a company behind it, the vendor is usually able to offer their own expertise and support during this migration process. And even if there's not a vendor or company you can work with, there's always the option of contractors or consultants, depending on what your data analysis and cleanup and migration needs are. So the short of it is there are plenty of both tools and experts that you can work with as you get through this data planning and prep to get into your new CMS. Second section, how to conduct efficient data cleanup. So getting into some more of the detail of what does data cleanup entail, and especially as you're looking for going into the new CMS. Though, of course, I will note data cleanup is an important practice whether you're going into a new CMS or not. First question for this section, are there any recommended queries to run or tools to use in Excel to help streamline the process? So yes, one of the first ones we mentioned just a little bit ago was the Excel spreadsheet. And when you are using Microsoft Excel, there are several different tools and functionality available within Excel to help you isolate and streamline, provide bulk changes, replaces, or perhaps data parsing or merging, depending on what your data cleanup needs are. Some of the tools and functionality that I usually use very heavily when I'm doing data analysis and cleanup is the freeze views. So we are looking at quite a lot of data in these tables and usually needing to know what object identification number I'm looking at, which is usually over on the left vertical side, or the different fields that I'm looking at across the record, which typically populates horizontally around the top. So freezing those views so that as I'm scrolling down and working in record entry 558, I can still see what record object ID I'm looking at, as well as what field I am currently in that column and row. Filters. Filters is like the first huge, like, always have filters. This is a great way to isolate per column, which each column represents a field. A great way to isolate if there are controlled vocabulary and what's being used currently and what does not have a controlled vocabulary in it or is blank. Or also isolating fields where there should be required information in there for every record, regardless of what object type it is. You can very easily isolate all of the records that are completely blank in that field. So filters are a great way to see very quickly what is in your data and what is missing or perhaps not standardized in your data. The next big tool I use is find and replace. And there's some caution here because, of course, when you're using find and replace, whether in Excel or in your collections management system, it has the power to change quite a bit of your data that perhaps you did not intend for it to change. For example, if I want to do a find and replace of a vocabulary term, but just in the very specific subject field, I want to make sure that I'm executing that find and replace just for data that shows up in that column, AKA field. I do not want the word I'm using to do a find and replace in the subject field. I don't want that word to be finding and replacing everywhere else across all of my records. So be very specific on where you intend to change the data and that you understand where it may be changing the data that you may not intend. So another great way is you can always execute the find and replace, but then check data, doing some spot checking about where that data could show up elsewhere and has perhaps changed is something to do before you move on and do additional changes, just in case you need to use that undo button. I don't want you to have to go through and undo like the next dozen steps you did after that, only to discover that you did a find and replace on something you didn't intend to. So it's a great and powerful tool, but be very careful and do some checking. Removing duplicates. So when you're working in Excel, there's the ability to isolate duplication in data and be able to remove or transform that duplicate data. So depending on what your data cleanup needs are, this could be a very helpful tool. Additionally, sorting and being able to put the text to columns, being able to split out or merge the different text within the columns, and that could be numbers or alpha characters, and being able to perform sorts within those columns as well as you're doing that work can help you isolate and either separate out data that needs to go into different fields that's only been in one field, or being able to put together data that was put across different fields that now needs to be in one field. These particular tools may only be helpful once you understand how your data is exiting your current CMS and going into the new CMS. That will indicate to you whether there needs to be some data merging or some data splitting or division. Next question, are there any recommended queries to run or tools to use in Excel to help streamline the process? So this is moving from just like some Excel spreadsheet work to using the Power Query Editor within Excel. So it's a bit more of like a power tool that you have to click on a specific area in the data tab to launch the Power Query. And it will ask you to feed the current spreadsheet data into that Power Query. You can perform different functionality, and then you load it back into your spreadsheet. So the difference being it's a much more powerful tool. It's based much more on queries and transformation of data, and it's going to take you out of the spreadsheet while still using your spreadsheet data, and then it will put you back into your spreadsheet once you're done. So just if you've never done it before, that is the sort of behavior to expect once you launch that Power Query. Functionality in here is more powerful by its very nature, and I definitely recommend, if you are interested in using the Power Query tool, to play with a test version of your data so that you can use the tools and functionality to see what it does with your data, but without actually making some somewhat permanent or irreversible changes to your original data source. So first and most obvious, when you're using the Power Query, you can create like a step-by-step or query script for, we need to split this column, and then we're going to isolate and remove this prefix to this data, and then we're going to transform each of where this says X, it's going to be Y. You can do a multi-step query where each step will be done precedent to the next, and it will execute as a whole, and is what they call a script. Once you put all those steps together, they call it a script. Next, changing the data type. So you can do some mass changes in terms of this data should always be currency versus just numbers or perhaps just text. So there can be some data type transformation that's happening. You can, in the Power Query editor, do searches and grouping of data. So where there's perhaps data that needs to be pulled together or that overlaps or are very similar, it may be a helpful tool for you to group those all together for analysis and maybe even some data transformation. You can identify different data as a key piece of data and relate some of additional different points of data to it and perform changes or analysis depending on what your needs are based on identifying that key. If there are empty columns, you can more easily fill, or if there's like an auto piece of data that should always go in that particular column, you can do that fairly easily. There's converting to lists. So as you're looking at the different pieces of data, you can pull them out into separate lists to take a look at. You can extract text before, between, or after delimiters. This one has been particularly helpful for me recently, taking a look at a piece of data that included the control number, which was the accession number, the barcode with a prefix that had nothing to do with the barcode, and then several different pieces of data after that barcode that actually just needed to be removed. So being able to actually isolate multiple points of that one current piece of merged data has been very helpful to sort of extract, transform, delete, separate out. Another helpful is the mass adjust formatting or cleanse text. So when you're working in spreadsheets, and especially if you're pulling in data or moving data in a way that Excel assigns some sort of like, oh, it's this type of data, it's going to be currency or a calendar date. Needing to do a mass adjustment of the formatting or just like a general cleansing of the text is something that's much easier to perform in the Power Query editor. And then finally, like the splitting of data with a selection of how. So if you're not going to work with like the extracting text before, between, or after, and you just need to do a general split, you can do that as well and assign the specifics of that split. You can do this in Excel in a more rudimentary or basic fashion. Like you can only split, I believe, based on one characteristic and only ever from the left. Whereas when you're in the Power Query editor, you can split data multiple times with multiple different ways or delineations. And you can perform it whether it's to the left, to the right, however many numbers of characters. You have so many more options in doing the sort of advanced splitting of data. And similarly, while there is merge functions in the basic tools of Excel, we have much more advanced and more sophisticated or nuanced forms of being able to merge our data among the columns with selections of how. And then finally, merge queries with different join kinds. So this is perhaps getting into more of an advanced level of when you're getting into the Power Query editor, but being able to run certain queries that can isolate and pull together like data, or perhaps data that is not like the others, and being able to perform some advanced functionality after that with that data could be very helpful to you if that is something that your brain would enjoy and would enjoy that learning process. But as I said, for each of these different tools and functionality, these are even more powerful than just what is available in the normal Excel menu. So I certainly recommend and emphasize doing this on some test data and not like an original piece of your data. Question: can you recommend programs that help conduct efficient data cleanup? So in addition to Excel, both like the basic tools of Excel as well as the Power Query editor in Excel, there is a product called Open Refine. It's open source, so no money. It has a fairly robust community. And similar to Excel Power Query, you're going to want to use test data to get familiar with what the functions do. But there is a great amount of overlap in terms of the Excel Power Query to what Open Refine offers in its suite of tools. So for example, Open Refine has some of the basic Excel stuff like the filters, self-formatting, but it also offers some more advanced and sophisticated functionality like the trimming of white space to any area of your data you assign, doing some identical text changes. So isolating where there might be duplicate or similar data is fairly easy in Open Refine. And similarly, if you need to do grouping by facet, so whether that is a text facet, character facet, I think there's like 5 different types of facets you could do to help group your data to perform some analysis and transformation on. Similarly to the Power Query, there is the split or join of multi-valued cells. So similar to the Power Query robust functionality, Open Refine offers that similar level of nuance in terms of whether we're doing multiple different types of splitting or merging, and being able to assign a more advanced level or more nuanced level of how we want that data to split or join. There's also the concept of clustering and editing, so building off of being able to group similar text, or perhaps grouping by facet, being able to cluster that type of data together and doing some mass editing. And OpenRefine also offers suggested reconciliation. So using some of the what it is learning from your data and what it as the tool is interpreting as, this seems related, or this seems like it should be similar, or perhaps is the same thing. It will start to offer you these smart AI-informed different types of suggestions based on what it's learning and observing from your data. How to migrate into a new CMS successfully. So getting into our last section here, we've covered what to do to prepare for getting into a new CMS in our first section, with a good part of that being taking a look at our data, and then getting into our next section of what does data cleanup look like, or at least preparing ourselves and our data for that data migration piece. So now, how to actually execute and get into your new CMS. First question, what should we prepare ahead of time to ensure successful migration into a new system? So part one, I recommend considering where the data is going. So getting familiar with the new collections management system ahead of you, documenting what are the fields and functions in that new system, especially as they may be named something a little bit differently, or perhaps the fields are living somewhere in a different function or module. So getting to know where the fields and functions are in the new system, so it can help inform where your data may go. Also identifying what fields are required. So every CMS system, there's usually some sort of capability of being able to require a certain number of fields, and identifying the required fields, so that as the system is saving, it can support you and say, oh, you don't have this required piece of data. You need to enter in the accession number, for example, before we can save. That helps you know that if you are missing a core piece of data that is required in the new system, you know that you need to create that data or otherwise account for that data requirement, even though it's currently missing in your data. Also, establishing standards. So being informed about what the new system looks like, what's required, but also, of course, what the best practice is. So what are some of the industry standards that we want to follow? What are some of the in-house best practices that perhaps are in place but need a refresher, or that are not in place at all and you're the first to put them into place for your team? So establishing standards, which is not necessarily required from a technical perspective, but is certainly recommended from a successful program perspective. And then creating a data map, which is really just saying, this field over here with this data in my current CMS, it is mapping to this field over here in the new CMS. The fields could have the same names, but also there are many variations on what the field names could be, as well as where they may live if there are different modules within your collections management system. So having a data map of where your data is supposed to go in the new CMS can be incredibly helpful, both for you and your team, but as well as if you're working with a CMS vendor who is assisting you and supporting you through this migration process. What should we prepare ahead of time to ensure successful migration into a new system? So this is part two. We did the analysis of the data. We did the homework we needed to in order to create the data map. Now we need to test and refine. And this is an important part, because as much as you can plan and be on top of things in terms of data mapping and understanding where your data is going to go, there will always be a little bit of unexpected results from a migration, or perhaps some, oh, I forgot about this piece of migration, like data to migrate. So it's always a good idea to test or refine at least once before the final official migration. So I recommend performing a small test migration, whether that is something you practice on your own or work with a vendor on. Through that, identifying areas of the data that may not migrate correctly. So there is inevitably always a few parts of our data that's a little wonky, whether because of our own internal practices or because of the limitations of our past CMS, that may need to be addressed or massaged as they're being migrated. And then, of course, make a plan to clean up non-standard data. So anything that falls into like the data is wonky camp, anything where there's data missing but should be required, any place where there's data or perhaps like a controlled vocabulary that needs to be adjusted and matched to the new CMS vocabulary. So any of that non-standard data that is going to need a little bit more hands-on work, whether that is before, during, or after migration into the new CMS. And then after all of that, an analysis of whether it was successful and to what extent of that trial migration, you will then perform a larger trial migration if you're allowed more than just one practice run. So instead of doing like a small data test set for that first part, performing an actual rough draft version of trying to migrate all of your data and perhaps digital assets to see what is able to make it into the system correctly and what may still need some further massaging. Question, is there any information you recommend not migrating into the new system? So there are a few pieces of data you may wish to leave behind. And that is not a bad thing. You don't ever feel the pressure to have to migrate all of your data into the new CMS, but do be intentional if you are going to leave data behind, that it is a active decision you and the team are making, and you're aware of what that means when you're leaving it behind. Some possible examples for data that may be candidates for leaving behind are the data that no longer holds meaning or is out of date or incorrect. If you've had a collections management system in place for going on decades now, there very well could be like internal notes or different fields that were used back in the day that are now better captured in a different field or perhaps are no longer accurate. So data and fields that fall into those camps, you don't have to migrate over if they don't serve a purpose for you or your collection. Extensive audit logs. So if your current CMS logs every time a user comes in and changes something, which is a great practice, it is not necessarily something that you will need to transfer over to the new CMS. And in fact, because every CMS is different, a transferring of the audit log is never quite as seamless as we would like in an ideal world. And so there may have to be some custom fields or custom areas where this historical audit logs are kept. There are some different strategies around this if you'd still like to hold on to the audit data, but maybe not migrate it into your new CMS. So there are options, but just know that you don't have to necessarily move a log of every single change that's happened to your collection records over decades. Also consider records created for items not in the collection. This used to be huge back 20 or so years ago. Museums used to create records for objects that were being loaned to them, perhaps out of necessity, because I imagine 20 years ago, many CMS products at that time perhaps did not have a robust loan module to help track those temporary loans. So if there are records for items that are no longer in your collection, there is perhaps no reason for them to come over into the new CMS. Similarly, any sort of old vocabularies that may be in the data but are out of date, are perhaps culturally insensitive or no longer accurate, you don't have to move over those old vocabularies if they're no longer serving you or the collection. And then finally, any sort of donor, volunteer membership, or other information. Some of the collections management systems, as they've evolved, have tried to offer different tools for different aspects of museum as an organization functioning. So tracking monetary donors, for example, versus collection donors, tracking volunteer time and contact info, similar with membership data and subscription models. Those, if it works for you to be in the CMS and you are migrating that data into another CMS that can track and ingest that data, then by all means, go ahead and move that data over. But for many of us, if there was this type of data in the CMS at one point, it's typically no longer being actively inputted into the CMS now because there are better membership or donor management systems out there. And so if that's the case for you and the historical data lives elsewhere, you're no longer using it, then please don't feel the need to try and bring this into the new CMS, especially if the new CMS does not necessarily have a place for this type of data. The last thing I want you to do is try and create a whole bunch of custom fields and areas for this historical data that it's just never going to be looked at again. Question: how is artificial intelligence, AI, entering the conversation of data creation and management? Which is an excellent question, just like how is AI impacting the museum field or potential to impact the museum field is fascinating and ever evolving as we, as humans, try and learn each day of how AI can impact all areas of our lives. But as with any sort of innovative tool, it's going to be disruptive and there's going to be both challenges but also major opportunities. So some of what I see in terms of how AI can enter the conversation and support what our focus is today, which is about getting our preparation, our data prepped for our new CMS, there can be some areas where that is of great benefit. So what I'm seeing is one of the limitations is that artificial intelligence only knows what it has access to, which is a lot of information. Like AI does have access to an innumerable, like can't even conceive how much information it does have access to. However, in our field, and unlike other information that lives out there, much of our data is perhaps not already digital and perhaps not already online. I'm thinking of like the provenance research, the paper files for our objects, archive collections that have come in with different collection donations. A lot of what data we use to help inform what we catalog and how we're putting together descriptions and artist bios or donor bios, the AI does not have access to that. So it's a good awareness in general that the AI only knows what it has access to, but also keep in mind that as a museum or archives, there's still quite a bit of knowledge and data that you're using that is not accessible to the AI and therefore is only accessible to you as the human in that role. It can be very helpful for writer's block. So this is true whether it's cataloging or any other sort of industry and facet of work. Using AI questions and prompts can help you get over sort of that blank page syndrome. So can help construct or provide you different pieces of data to think about. I am by no means suggesting that you have AI write in total any of your stuff, but I think it can be very helpful as a creative and collaborative tool. You may consider AI for descriptions and artist biographies. So especially for that artist biography, if the artist is known, if there's data out there that the AI has access to, it can help inform and prompt and provide some of that basic research data for you to take and remix and evolve into your artist bio. And similarly for descriptions, depending on how well known or how out there the particular object or group of objects is, you may find some good information to include and pull in for your descriptions. I do wonder and would love to see over this next year how AI can be instructive for data management. So thinking more of that process piece and how we may be able to be further effective and efficient on how we're doing our data creation, how we're doing data management, and that constant practice of refinement, and how AI may be able to be helpful or instructive or otherwise supportive of that process. So the details remain to be seen, but I do see it helping here. And finally, and thinking about our second section about data cleanup and those tools we were talking about, I can see AI being very helpful for further innovating on and further offering more robust tools for us to identify patterns that we certainly can't see as humans and that are perhaps patterns that even elude Excel Power Query and Open Refine currently, that could help us gather and synthesize our data in a powerful way we've never been able to do before, as well as help to identify how we may want to remix or transform those areas of data. So those last two pieces can be, I think, quite powerful, but we have yet to see any of the specific details of what that may look like. As with anything, and as we talked about in section 2 about data migration and cleanup, testing and getting familiar with AI tools that are available and how they may be able to help and inform your work is definitely something I recommend, and I think is going to be something we learn about even more in this next year to 2 years. So Stay tuned. We do plan on covering artificial intelligence in the museum as a broader topic coming up a few months from now. So if it's a topic of interest to you, make sure that you tune in when we get to that subject in the new year. All right, getting into resources, of which there's quite a bit, because this is like the capstone webinar for the work we've gone through and done together over these last 6 months. So first up, as this was the Ask Me Anything webinar, it is the capstone to these previous 6 webinars we've done together. So it covers all the topics and building blocks that lead up to preparing you, your museum, and your collection data for getting into a shiny brand new collections management system. So depending on if you need a refresher or if you missed any of these webinars, they go into much more detail about the start to finish process. What are some of the barriers for getting into a new CMS, evaluating the shape of data, creating strategies and a plan for that data remediation, aka cleanup, and then thinking about other facets of migration that should be considered, like where does your digital storage live, how does it connect, and the ultimate preparation for the migration and getting into your new CMS. There are also a dozen or so blog posts, so if you're more of a read and instructive person versus an audiovisual person for your learning, we do have much of the webinar content translated into blog posts for you to do quick and easy searches on for the topics that you need that are of the most interest or most of the moment to be helpful to you when you're on this journey towards your new CMS. So we've got quite a few for you here listed and available on Lucidea's Think Clearly blog. You can just head over there and enter in the subject that you are interested in, or you can isolate it by author. So if you want to see things that have been written by myself for the museum, you can also narrow it down that way. Here's the second part for our Think Clearly blog list. So getting into some more detail on that data migration and data cleanup details and instructions. And then finally, for the Lucidea resources, we went over some of the specific webinars that are of interest, but of course, there's a whole webinar suite of webinars myself and other colleagues and experts have offered through the Lucidea platform. I also want to highlight quite a bit of our data preparation, assessment, cleanup, and even migration can be covered by grants. So you can check out different grant opportunities via the Lucidea grants directory. And if grant writing is new or not quite as comfortable for you, we also have a workbook and templates that Lucidea and I collaborated on that are freely available for you to download. So if grants are in your future, there's some resources for you there too. Okay, and last resource for you, there's a free e-copy version available for you of my most recent book, courtesy of Lucidea Press, Prepare for Takeoff, Get Your Museum Digital Project Off the Ground. So this particular book will be helpful for the broader digital projects that you have in your digital program that you're creating and how the CMS may be a part or a support of that particular program, but offers many other sort of best practices, standards, etc. for your digital program. And with that, I'll hand it back over to you, Bradley.
Thank you, Rachel, for the wonderful presentation. And if you'd like to learn more about our museum collections management system called Argus, please feel free to visit our website or reach out to us at sales@lucidea.com, and we would be happy to have a chat with you. And if you have any more questions on any of our software or our company, our contact details are listed on the screen. Please stay tuned for more webinars and content related to this series. And on behalf of the Lucidea team, I thank you all for attending today. And until next time, thanks.